put this out of your way?
I don't need a podium. But
Okay, I'll put this out of the way, and so if anybody thinks they will have trouble hearing, if you want to just slide your chairs up, we can gather around them like a campfire. Okay? All right, so for the next hour, Kit's gonna tell us his stories, and I'm sure you guys will have questions if you answer.
What?
Anybody wants my share, they can have this one. So.
Honey, you need to move closer to the
Last time I was here,
because they won't pick it up.
some of you said, well, they wanted me to talk about when I was a test pilot. And I can do that. What I did was went through all my test pilot experience and started out at Lamson Aircraft and went through Boeing for several years. And I picked two programs I wanted to talk about. One is a program that was the biggest challenge, and the other was the program that was the most fun. And so I'll start out with the challenge. And the airplane was called the Air Tractor. And when I hired on, I'll pass this around. This is the prototype airplane. And when I
Here, hold it up more longer, please.
prototype airplane, and it was the worst airplane I've ever flown. I'll pass this around.
Really stable.
When I hired on with him, the FAA pilot came to me and he said, he called me on the phone. He said, I want you to come over to the office. I got to talk to you about that airplane. So I went over to his office and he sat there. His name is Peterson. Looked at me for maybe 5 minutes. He didn't say a word. Finally he said, geez, be really careful. And I said, what do you mean? He said, just be careful. Well, so the next day I decided to go fly the airplane. I hadn't even seen the airplane. And I got over there and it was an ugly looking airplane. And I flew it and I found out it didn't have one good thing about it. There wasn't, it was the worst flying airplane I've ever been in. And it just truly didn't have one good thing to say about it. And then I started looking at the records. The airplane was grossly overweight. This was supposed to be a crop duster, and it was so much overweight that we could hardly haul any fluids in it. So it was sort of back to the drawing board. And so we had a goal. Now, one thing with that airplane that was important, there was only one wing panel that fit all four positions. There was only one tail component that fits the fins, horizontal stabilizer, elevator, and rudder. This was to cut down on the number of parts needed to build an airplane. So it was back to the drawing board, and after about 3 or 4 months, we had conceived the final design on it. And by the time we finished the test program, it was absolutely one of the sweetest flying airplanes you'd ever get in. It had no roll-off installs. It was just a great airplane. And we lifted 300 gallons of water with it, and that's a pretty good load. And unfortunately, about a month from final testing, which the only thing left in the test program was engine cooling, and they sawed off the program. And the #1 production airplane is still around at Yakima in pieces, but I haven't seen it. But my oldest son has seen the remains of it. I'd like to get it now and finish the 3 or 4 hours of engine cooling test. You'll notice in the photograph that prototype airplane has a cowling on it, but crop dusters don't want to fly airplanes with cowling, because they want to be able to get access to the engine without removing any parts and this type of thing. The bad feature in it is the R985 engine without the cowling and baffles has an oil cooling problem. So if you see these old crop dusters, they'll have sometimes 2, maybe even 3 oil coolers, to keep the engine oil cool. And that just says one thing: the barrels on the engine are running very hot. And so when we ran the tests on the Lamson airplane, we found out it was made a great deal more sense to have a cowling on it than baffles to keep the cooling. And we had no oil cooling problems at all in that airplane. And you know, we talk about first flights a lot of, particularly if you're into the kit planes or kit airplanes in particular. There's a lot of talk about improper pre-flighting and planning of the flight test program. On that particular airplane, I would just use the Acamore Airport and I just run up to flying speed and lift it off and fly down the runway and land. And had a pretty good feel out of the airplane. And the production airplane, well, I have this theory, you know, if it looks like a bad airplane, it is. And the production airplane came out. It's a very nice looking airplane, and it just was perfect in stall and handling qualities. Could lift hellacious loads because we got rid of the overweight on the airplane. And we also, you'll notice we moved the interplane struts in on the wing, and that saved quite a few pounds of weight. Just in careful engineering on that. I'll send this one around. So that was the biggest challenge, was to get rid of several hundred pounds of weight in an airplane and make it fly like an airplane. And it was a very, very good airplane. And we had, I don't know how many of you have heard of the name Myra Slovak,
Yeah.
but he was working for me at the time. And when we were going to do the dive test, the FAA had this crazy idea. You have to dive to a certain speed calculated, and the interesting thing is in a vertical dive at full power, we couldn't reach that speed. Myra came to me and he says, "No, you got a family, I'll fly the thing and do the dive test." But we didn't do that. But Myra is kind of a crazy guy. Now the design of the airplane on the prototype, the fuselage was open from the cockpit back, no fabric. This was the idea of the crop dusters, because then when it lands, you take a hose and wash off all the chemicals. But the problem with that is, without the covering on the fuselage, the directional stability of the airplane was really, really bad. On the prototype airplane, you could fly along and kick in the rudder. It would go to about 10 degrees yaw and just keep on flying. And you'd have to use the rudder to kick it back. Well, that isn't very good handling qualities. If you gave us input, we'll say nose down on the stick, just an input, the airplane would dive and come up, and about the third oscillation it would either be going straight down or straight up. And no natural damping of any kind at all. The engine, without the cowling, ran hotter than a pistol. And we already knew this was going to be the case because of the dusters. But that was sort of the end of the program, but we had a very, very nice flying airplane, and I wouldn't hesitate to take anybody in this room that has just a little bit of flying time and say, you can go fly that airplane because it doesn't have any bad habits. And you could set up approach speed. This is empty airplane now, no crop dusting stuff in it. You could set up the approach speed, and if you didn't flare, it didn't make any difference. You'd come in the ground effect, and it would sort of reduce the sink rate at about 50%, and you're on the ground. And the FAA pilot, with this fellow Peterson, when he came over to fly it on the first flight, he came in and I told him, he said, you don't have to worry much about the flare. He came in and said, boy, that's the greatest thing I've ever flown. He said, you don't really have to do anything, just get the speed on and the airplane takes care of itself. And one of the requirements the FAA came up with, which was a surprise, you have to demonstrate 4 takeoffs of unimproved field. And I said, well, okay, what do you mean unimproved? And Mr. Peterson says, well, they're sort of talking about a freshly plowed field.
Oh, God.
And I said, you gotta be kidding. And he says, no, we want to see that demonstrated, 4 landings and takeoffs. So I said, okay, we picked a field and it had been plowed and disked. And so I went up in the first approach. I thought, well, I'll land parallel to the disc grooves. Big mistake, because when you get on the ground, the airplane can't tell which groove it's going to run in.
Yeah.
And it was all over the place. So I said, well, heck, the next 3 I'll land and take off crossways. And it was rough, but the airplane accomplished it with no damage. And we kind of kidded the FAA, said, now you know that this is an indestructible airplane, what do you want us to do with it? As I said, the company ran out of money and that folded up that program. But the challenge, of course, was get rid of the excess weight, an airplane that would handle nicely, and the gull wing on the upper gull was designed into the airplane for hopper loading. So you taxi up to the loading position, they'd swing the hopper over the airplane, one shot into the hopper, and you close the door and you're on your way, instead of handing the bags up or whatever you're using. And it was a good practice. The gull wing was such that you didn't have too much blinded, but of course these big gulls are going to be in your way of vision a little bit. And to change the pilot from looking into the cockpit and back out, we put the instruments on the trailing edge of the gull. So you could be flying, you could see the instrument clearly without any effort at all. So that was a good feature. And the landing gear had a 12-inch stroke on the oleos. That's about that much. And that's what was so good in the unimproved fields.
Yeah, I bet.
And also they wanted, well, this was kind of between me and Peterson. I said, I'll bet I can land that airplane and stop it within 300 feet. And he said, no, you won't. So he had this little bet going. So I found, now this is an empty airplane, mind you, just fuel, and that's all we had on board. But I came in with the feet on the brakes. Touchdown tail wheel first, and fully stopped in 300 feet. So the airplane had a lot of potential, but never made it out.
You know, I had flat spots on your tires.
Oh, sure. The tires are replaceable. Then the next program I got into was a program at Boeing, which was affectionately known as the Little Snoot program. This was a program to develop reconnaissance equipment for the Vietnam War. And Boeing, I don't know, they picked me because I guess I was the oldest guy and they didn't care about me. But anyway, they said, go out and find an airplane. So I thought a B-25 or an A-26 would be good airplanes for the job. I located one of each and told the Boeing purchasing department where they were. And they screwed around long enough that our competitor Douglas bought one of them and Lockheed bought the other one. So we ran some numbers and figured out we could do the same job with a Beechcraft D-18. And I searched around and I found this little airplane that was the color was the way it was when we bought it. This one already has the revised nose on it. And we had actually the very first glass cockpits that were ever flown was in this airplane.
Show the camera, please.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
And the airplane 2 years later ended up looking like this.
Wow.
And this program was supposed to last 6 months. It went 2 years. And it was the most fun program I've ever been on. Now, the first phase of the program was developing film for the Air Force Fighter Simulator Program. Okay, what were the fighters? They're all jets. And we had to film with camera, what do you call it, messing around with the camera speeds, so so that when it was projected in the simulator, it was Mach 1. Take that Beechcraft, we go out 30 miles off the coast, drop down to 15 feet elevation, and fly through, coming inland at Grays Harbor area, and there was a boat there that had been used for the World's Fair as a hotel boat here in Seattle. It was towed out to the coast there and put as a hotel for Ocean Shores. And it's still out there, however, it's laying on its side now. But that was our first target. And then the second target was the paper mills around Grays Harbor. And then all the railroad bridges and so forth as you come in through, what is that highway? Do you remember, John?
No, through Elma and Montesano.
Yeah, Elma, Montesano, and this was all done 50 feet above terrain. So that was the fun part of the program. I got to legally fly and buzz everybody. But, then and the final target on the program was the ships that were tied up in a big raft of ships just north of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. And we come over the bridge, and 50 feet above the bridge you could see the threads on the cable clamps. That's how close we were. And then they would refilm this and put it in the simulator, and then they brought about 20 Air Force and Navy pilots in. We gave them a list of the targets, and we said, you find those targets and just arm your weapons and fire them when they come into view. 6% of them. That's all they could find. And I said, Mach 1, you're moving pretty doggone fast, and 50 feet above the ground. And I'll tell you, those targets come up really quick. I'd flown that course enough times that I could get in the simulator and get 40 to 50% of them, but you only had 3 seconds from when they come into view, and so you had to fire your weapon. 3 seconds is not very long to identify a weapon and fire it. And that was phase 1 of the program. Then they came up with a new idea on reconnaissance, and this is where the glass panel come in, because we had 2 video tubes, one in front of the pilot and one in front of the co-pilot, and these were all tied in with an orthicon video, which is a video which also used infrared. And they would set up targets, and we'd go out at night and fly these various tracks to find these targets. And they were all up through the mountains here, and we'd do this 50 feet above terrain. And I wasn't about to fly those at night the first time, I'll tell you that. So the plan was I would go through and fly the target in daylight hours, 50 feet above the terrain, or above obstacles, because there were trees sticking up and stuff like that. And I would note them on my pad, where they were, how many minutes in, and then we'd go out at 2 o'clock in the morning and fly that same track. And your whole flight is on a screen that's no bigger than this. And this is the way the airplane ended up. I'll pass this on around too.
Okay, show the camera.
Beg pardon?
You gotta show the picture.
Remember,
Oh.
show the camera.
Take it back here. Gotta show the camera.
Thank you.
I have a short memory. But anyway, the program went along, and we got better and better, and the camera kept being improved. And it became pretty obvious that we could detect things at night that no other reconnaissance method could. So they set up a test for us at the Yakima Firing Center, and they took 85 tanks in there and they hid them. And then we were officially attached to a voodoo squadron, which I loved this, and they would take off and go in there and get their pictures and be back on the ground while we were running engine checks. Then we'd go out and fly the same pattern. Well, the Air Force reconnaissance airplanes were getting 10% of the hidden tanks. This is at night now. These tanks are hidden under camouflage nets. We went in on the first run and picked up 82 of the tanks. And this is kind of the Army Air Force pilots got a little bent out of shape because, and then they said, well, yeah, but you're slow enough that you can go there. We're going in there fast. And we said, if we had this in your airplane, we could go in there fast and still pick them up. And what this would do, the heat that was in the tanks from the daylight at 2 o'clock in the morning was still there, and this orthocon video would pick it up. And what we discovered in going over the data later was we had found all 85 of them, because some of them were Siamese tanks sitting together and we didn't identify them as 2 tanks. And the system was very, very darn good. And then we went to 2 bases in California, and they'd have targets set up all over the base, and we didn't even know what the targets were. We were just supposed to go in and fly these courses and come back and find these targets, and they'd come out. And we were doing pretty consistently over 80% of the targets we could pick up. So then the engineers that were controlling the program said, well, we'll go to Long Beach, Washington, and we'll set the targets up down there. So this is great because we had a cabin down there. So they went down there and set up these targets, and then we'd make the run up the beach, and we only knew that there were X number of targets for each run. We go through, and the intelligence people watching the video in the back, they say, well, there's the target, there's the target. And they were coming up 80% all the time, or better, 80% or better. And I had cautioned the Boeing cars that were running up and down the beach. I said, there's places there where there's streams across the beach, and you don't want to hit those at high speed, because they're roaring up the beach at 45, 50 miles an hour. Well, just south of Oceanside, is it?
Ocean Park.
Ocean Park, there was a stream come through and it had cut down about 12, 14 inches in the sand, and they hit it at 40 miles an hour. And that poor Boeing station wagon didn't drive very good after that. But all we would do is send notice in the paper saying that there'll be reconnaissance flying in this area at night from the hours of 2 to 4 a.m. And doggone, telephones would just light up. You know, we had it on the TV, we had it on the radio, we had it in the newspapers. There'd still be a whole bunch of phone calls come in about this airplane flying low at night. And 50 feet's pretty low with the Beechcraft. They're not quiet. But we flew 2 programs, one in California and one in Nevada on the firing centers. And at the time of that, the Watsonville, is it called, air show was on. So I thought, well, what the heck? I'll just run over there on Saturday and stay at the show Saturday and Sunday, because it'd be named flight schedule. And by golly, I won the trophy for the most unusual airplane. I thought that was pretty darn good, you know, so I come back with the trophy and all these plaques, and when I landed at Paine Field, first thing Boeing did says, where's the trophies and plaques? They took them away, and I have no idea where they were. But we got more attention at the Watsonville show than I think any of the other airplanes there, because in fact, in the second picture I passed around, you can see the wingtip lights. These are photo flash lights, strobe lights, and every flight we made, by the way, was 200 to 400 pounds over gross weight. And of course, the big concern of that is you drop an engine too low, you're going to be in trouble. But fortunately, we went through the whole program, almost 2,000 hours, and lost only 1 engine. And that we lost just after takeoff out of Boeing Field and brought it back in. But the Beechcraft's a pretty good airplane. It's a dicey little bugger, and of course everybody get in the airplane and look at the instrument and say, what's that for? You know, 2 TVs up there. All in those days, the glass panel wasn't even talked about, but we had airspeed, altitude, and all that stuff displayed on the panel. Plus, the orthocon video was so good that we could see the snags sticking up out of the tops of the trees and stuff like that. And you're coming along at 180 miles an hour, it's a good idea you see those things. But, that was a very fun program, and sometimes when I'd go out on my daily program, my son John was in school on Mercer Island, so I'd fly over the school grounds and RPM up. He could brag, that's my dad. But
My teacher loved you.
the program was just shy, a little bit shy of 2,000 hours of flying. And, it was, at one point, the blue picture there is after I took it down to California and had the mods put on for, get a little more horsepower out of the engines, the short stacks and different cowl treatment, different exhausts. And I think we gained 200 pounds, but most of the time we were overweight at takeoff. And that was the fun program. Every minute of it I enjoyed greatly, and of course I didn't get a lot of sleep because I'd fly the program in the afternoon, and then the next morning at 2 o'clock we'd take off and refly the program. So it was, but it affectionately was known as Little Snoop. And some of the stuff we developed, there's one, yeah, this is a good thing to bring up. The Coast Guard came to us and said, if this airplane is so good at detecting stuff, could you locate a lifeboat adrift in the water? And I said, yeah, we can. And they said, okay, we're going to put a 28-foot lifeboat adrift in the Straits. And we want you to go up there and see if you can find it. So we took off at 2 o'clock in the morning. The lifeboat had been launched 2 hours before we took off. And we had a real stroke of luck on this one. There were 2 men aboard the lifeboat. One of them lit a cigarette. We were 54 miles away from him, we could pick him up. I said to the Coast Guard pilot, was riding the co-pilot, I said, I got the boat. He said, what are you talking about? I said, got the boat. See that little white dot there? That's somebody on the boat smoking a cigarette. And he said, no, that can't be. And I said, okay, we'll go straight to that dot and I'll prove it to you. So we did 53 miles. We flew right across 10 feet above the lifeboat. This guy looks at me and he says, that's Commander so-and-so on there. You recognize him in the video. And you know, I thought this is the greatest thing going because all that Coast Guard helicopters could be fitted out with this stuff, and anybody on the water, as long as they're still alive, you can pick them up. Wow. Yes?
Do you have any idea what happened to that stuff after you guys got done with all these tests?
Scrapped.
Pardon me?
Scrapped.
Really?
Yep.
And it was first generation infrareds.
Yeah, it was the first cut-at glass panels. But, you know, I couldn't even get anybody interested in glass panels then.
So what happened was that the stuff had to mature a little bit more before they started actually putting it on? Okay.
Yeah. We didn't have all the features that you have in the glass panels today. How many of you got glass panels in your airplanes? Anybody? I can't believe it.
I can't.
Rich pilots, eh?
How do you fly without a glass panel?
You have these 6 little round things on the wing.
Oh, the steam gauge.
Look out.
That's funny.
Kip, the
That
way
is
you
so
did.
funny.
Beg pardon?
The same way you did.
And I get a kick out of it.
I don't know whether you knew, but a lot of that work with Little Snoop was done in support of the TFX fighter plane development.
Yeah, it was. Yeah,
And
yes, that's right.
I was a young engineer at the time, working on reconnaissance.
Talk loud, please.
Which airplane was that?
Little
Little
Snoop.
Snoop,
The Beechcraft.
support of the TFX. The
That went into-
TFX eventually became the F-111.
Okay.
See, all that stuff, the program was sawed off after 2 years because, well, I assumed they just ran out of money, but they apparently thought they had enough information to pass it on. But, you know, it was 12 or 14 years later that they started talking glass panels. Now, the one thing we discovered in the Beechcraft was the distance from the video tube to our body was close enough that we got radiation. And so on the big jets like the 747, for example, they're 2 inches further away than the radiation hazard. So in theory, you don't have any radiation problems now. But,
Do you glow in the dark?
You made it this long, it couldn't have been that bad.
I have a question for you.
yes,
Charles Lindbergh is just a mysterious figure that is kind of larger than life, and I know you knew him and flew with him and respect him.
now, who was that?
Charles Lindbergh.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And,
Yeah, I did 4
and
demonstration flights with him.
I know that he, you know, he had some really serious paparazzi.
Well, on one flight with Lindbergh, we came in and landed, and there's a pack of news people on the ground. And I said to him, I said, well, I'll fill in the logs and then I'll join you. And filled in the logbooks, you know, and we got on the ladder, and there's the news people still there. So that tells me that Lindbergh didn't go out.
Oh.
So I got up and walked in the back of the airplane. He was sitting back there, and he said, I won't go out with them there. And I said, well, oh, and he says, can you get rid of them? And I said, well, I'll give it a try. I know the head man down there. So I went down to Gordy Williams, and I said, can you get rid of the news people? And he said, well, I can get rid of all the Boeing news people, but I'll have to throw my good graces on the other guys, see if they leave, but they did. They all left. And I had an American Bantam car at that time. You know what an American Bantam is? Well, Lindbergh rode with me in my American Bantam back to the post-flight conference.
Puts his knees up over his head.
No, the Bantam had a lot of room in it.
Yeah.
Wasn't a very great car, but you know, in those days I'd punch out 45 miles the gallon. That's not too shabby.
Yeah, wow.
Um,
I really enjoyed your story about saving the people in your crew when you landed with one wheel in the wing.
Oh, that was a B-17 incident. I was in the training command, flew B-17, got about 3,000 hours in them in the time I flew them. But this one night we were out, I had a brand new crew on board. They'd never been in the B-17 before, and the first night flight is it's a pretty taxing thing for them. So we were at an auxiliary field down in Texas shooting landings, and on this one landing, just as touchdown, the red light came on in the gear. So I got the power back on and got it back in the air. And I said to the young man in the pilot's seat, I said, what's your gear look like? He said, I don't know. First time in the airplane, so he was right, he didn't know. So I switched seats with him. Sure enough, the retraction screw had run out of its drive. And then it flopped back against the main strut, so we had no way of retracting that gear. So we flew back to the base, like 2 o'clock in the morning, and get back to the base, and the tower says, well, you circle around there, the CO wants to come and look at the landing gear. So I flew by, and I was also acting engineering officer at that time in our squadron. And, I pretty well could see what was wrong. We flew by the tower, and they take the biscuit gun and try to shine on the gear and tell me what was wrong. I'm 5 feet away from it, they're 200 feet away. And so the first pass, he said, well, we couldn't get a good look at that gear, could you come a little closer? So I said to the boys on the flight, I said, now everybody be quiet, I'm going to get close. And I came by, and I had about 10-foot clearance on the wingtip to the tower.
Oh, boy.
And as we approached, the tower guys bailed out down the stairs. We flew by, the colonel just shines the light on the gear, and he says, well, you're right. And I said, okay, I told you, if I'm an engineering officer, I ought to be able to understand what's looking like in the gear. Well, he said, take the airplane to San Antonio and put it in the sand pit. Now, that's what we did with disabled airplanes. The bad thing with doing that is the airplanes are done, they're finished, class 26.
Doesn't that rip the tail off?
Oh yeah, I'll get to that. So we started out for San Antonio, and about 25 or 30 minutes out, the number 1 engine packed up.
Oh, jeez.
So now we're not going to climb anymore. And with that gear out, we're just barely able to hold our altitude. So I called the base back and said, we've lost number one engine. They said, do you have sufficient power, you know, to continue to San Antonio? I said, yeah, I can do it. So they said, okay, continue on to San Antonio. So not more than 15 minutes later, number two engine packed up. So now it's all downhill. And so we turned around, called the base, said I was going to make every effort to make it back to base, but it was looking pretty iffy. So I briefed the crew. I said, everybody get your chutes on. On the B-17, your pack is separate from your harness. So it's a good idea to make sure you clip the pack on before you bail out.
Yeah.
So anyway, all these boys, and they're all sitting in the back of the airplane, get down to 1,500 feet, I hit the alarm bell. I don't feel any doors blow off or anything, you know, and I look back and they're all sitting there like this. So I called my crew chief up and I said, what's going on? He said, oh, we took a vote.
Oh.
We figure you're going to land, so we're going to go with you. So now I'm thinking, you know, if I get these guys in the back and I land with that ball turret, as soon as it hits the ground, the tail's gone.
Yeah.
I wasn't too happy about that. We arrived back at the base between 300 and 400 feet above the ground.
Wow.
Turned on final, and the decision was I'd put all the gear down I could get down and land the airplane. We did. Very little damage. 3 days later, we did a test flight on the airplane, back in the air. But Boeing didn't like that idea. So they called me up to Seattle.
Okay, wait a minute. You skipped a part. How did you land?
All gear down, but the left gear wouldn't support the load of the airplane. And at about 65 knots, the wing got to the ground. And the Roswell Air Base had a 1 mile square mat. So there wasn't any problem running off the edge of the runway. But the interesting thing was the runways are marked with these oil-burning flare pots that look like bombs. And as we did this slow 90-degree turn, one of those kerosene pots bounced up in the cowling on number one engine. So when it came to stop, I looked out there and I could see this flickering of this light, you know, and I said, everybody out, you know, hit the old alarm bell, and they all went bailing out. The colonel comes around his Jeep and goes there and picks it up and holds it up like this. Anyway, then I was sent back to Boeing, you know, to defend my position of violating the SOP. And the standard SOP at that time was you retract all the gear you can and land the airplane on the belly.
Yeah.
The tail's gone. The airplane is essentially class 26. So anyway, I arrived up in Seattle. I'm a first lieutenant. I walk into the room at Boeing, and there's 25 people sitting around this long, I always say, beautiful walnut table. And one guy stands up and he said, gentlemen, here's the young whippersnapper that thinks he knows more than all of you. I'm kind of outnumbered here. And I stood there for a minute and I said, I had the airplane flying in 3 days. How's that sound? All of a sudden the room got really quiet. And then we got into a discussion and they wanted to know what the damage was, and I had all that stuff written down for them. So anyway, when the meeting was over, M.D. Showalter, who was chief of flight tests at that time, got up and he said, well, Lieutenant, we're glad you came up here and talked to us, and we're going to take what you had to say under consideration. And then he said, if you want a job after the war's over, call me. 35 years at Boeing. But, you know, there are a lot of crazy stuff that happens. I can't remember who it was here asked me about flight tests at Boeing, what it's like, you know. The only exciting things in flight tests is when you do flutter flights. And the flutter flights are what they call a select crew, and then you get so much money at the end of the flights divided amongst the 3 crew members. Okay, you couldn't volunteer for that job if you were handpicked by whoever the chief of flight test was at the time. And when the Braniff 720 came up for flutter test, I was selected for that. And I thought that was a pretty good deal. I'm going to make a few bucks extra here. And everybody knows you don't have any trouble on flutter flights. Well, we got up on the conditions, and what you do, you run the condition, then you increase the speed by 2 knots, and then 2 knots, and so on. And the test engineers are monitoring all the data on the ground. They tell you what your next target is. And so we got the next target, and we ran up to that speed and put the control inputs in, and put it mildly, all hell broke loose. And I was watching the wing, and it looked like a ribbon. And the fighter pilot saying, "Slow down, you're coming apart." And we got her slowed down, and everything that was removable on that airplane came off. Cowlings, inspection panels, wing to body fairings, and stuff like that. And what had happened is the outboard aileron lockouts had failed on the left wing, the right wing, excuse me. And then it became a driver. And, that's not good at high speed. So they made a repair and a design change, and we went back up. Next flight, same condition, same thing happened.
Oh, my.
So we figured, hey, we're getting really experienced at this, you know. But you don't get any money for that, so you have to complete all the conditions before you get paid off. Well, then they had another redesign, went up, same thing happened the third time.
Jeez.
So in the post-flight conference, I got a name around Boeing as the guy that always said, "Fix it." And they went around the room and got to me, and I said, "Fix it. You know, what's going on here? You guys are fiddling around and we're getting the same problem. Why don't we fix it?" So that was the first indication of that. And then, but all through the career of 707, 720, 727, 737, 747, we'd get in the conference when we'd have, you know, there are always little minor things that happen. And the chief engineer on the 747 going around the room, and he looks at it, he says, "I'm not even going to ask you." But I had that reputation. It just, you know, the design engineers think that their design is pretty good, or they wouldn't have it. And they don't like to have you tell them that they better fix it. But on the 707s, we had a problem with the rudder would back out. You'd lose an engine, you'd put the rudder in, the pedals are there, but the rudder backs right out. And that gets pretty interesting. We lost, I can't remember which airplane it was, we took off Paine Field, lost number 4 engine right at liftoff. And you know where Rainier Country Club is? We crossed over to the country club about 40 feet above the building. There wasn't anybody in the building, they were all scrambling out. But that's where we decided, well, my statement in the post-flight conference is, we're going to fix this whether you like it or not. It'll be either before we have an accident or after we lose an airplane with a full load of passengers, but you'll fix it. And we did, we put a boosted rudder on it. They were, up before that, they were aerodynamically boosted. But if the yaw got enough, the aerodynamic boosting would reverse. And it would back the rudder right out. You couldn't hold it with a rudder pedal.
I have a request for you to tell the story about Lake Kavanaugh.
About what?
Lake Kavanaugh.
Oh, well, if anybody feels like good diving, go up there and find the engine that shook off of a Braniff airplane. We're doing Dutch roll. And the Dutch roll recovery is very fussy. If you don't do it right, the end result is a snap roll. Not a good idea. And that happened right over Lake Kavanaugh on a training flight. I was scheduled to be a check pilot on that training flight, and they took me off to fly a C-46. But, well, that's not right. That wasn't a C-46. I was supposed to go off on another performance test. But we were off over the Hood Canal flying, and Dick Slesh was with me, and he said, Boeing radio called us and said, we've lost contact with the Braniff trainer. And we hear there's a large aircraft crashed at Arlington. So Dix looked at me and he says, you know where Arlington is? I said, sure do. And he said, let's go over there and look. And we got there and most of the airplane was in the river, in pieces, of course. And we flew over 3 or 4 times, looked at it, and we thought, can't be any survivors. What's up on the shore is burning, and what's in the water is pretty totally submerged. So we kind of called the tower and said, or the Boeing radio, and said, it doesn't look like there's any survivors. Well, the interesting thing was that there were 3 guys in the river, just their heads out of the water walking towards shore. There were 8 on board the airplane, 4 fatalities, 4 survivors. And Bill Alsop, one of the guys, said, you buggers, he said, you flew right over us and didn't see us in the river. But we sure did, we did. But he walked to a farmhouse and called in and got an ambulance to come out. But 3 of the 4 were in the aft lavatories. So I guess that's a good, safe place to be. And Bill Alsop was in the main cabin. He had just gotten out of his seat to move to the other side because the heat of the fire on the left side was getting pretty uncomfortable. And he was standing up when the airplane hit the water.
Ouch.
And they drove him through 20-some rows of seats.
Yeah.
And his injury was a broken shoulder.
Lucky man.
And, have to redesign those seats. They didn't stand that too well. Yes, sir.
I'm thinking I got a foggy mind here, but it seemed like the Flying Tigers, there was a Kit Carson, that was before your time, wasn't it?
Well, hey, there's a lot of us out there.
Okay.
Nobody likes
The
it.
squadron in the Air Force I was in had Daniel Boone Rose and Davy Crockett, I can't remember what his name was, and then when I came in, so they tagged me with Kit. And we were the 3 Musketeers. And we were in the training command, of course, and we got quite a bit of a reputation, and I don't know whether it deserved or not.
And if I recall, you first started flying out of California, right? No. Okay.
No, I first started flying in Ohio. Sold it when I was 12 years old
Wow.
in a glider that I built.
That's right. Okay.
I have a question. I'd be really curious to know, I think it was when, correct me if I'm wrong, when you were 13, you and your older brother were able to manage an airport for
Yeah.
5 years.
I was 12.
Okay, 12. Tell us about that.
Yeah, first off, when Lindbergh flew the ocean, my dad had this radio room which was off limits to the kids, okay? But that particular night, we were able to go in and listen to the radio station WPA in Cleveland, and they were given reports from this ship, heard the airplane or saw it and so forth. My dad had a National Geographic map on the wall, and he'd go up and put a pin in. We got to the one and said, well, at such and such a time, the airplane was seen over Ireland. My dad put a pin in. He says, well, it's over. He made it. I'll tell you, it's a long way from Ireland to Paris. And I've flown it many times in jets, but it's a good, healthy flight.
Yeah, particularly at 100 miles an hour.
But that was the beginning. So I was 6 years old at the time, and my brother and I decided flying was what we wanted to do. So we started out with model airplanes and stuff like that. But when I was 10, we bought plans for a glider from an outfit called Logan Aviation in Cleveland, Ohio. The plans cost us $25. And they came in a tube, 4 feet long and about that big around. And we brought them home, and at dinner that night, my dad says, in his usual way, did you spend some money today? And we said, yeah. And he said, what for? And we bought glider plans. He said, well, my older brother was an engineer. Why don't you bring him out here and we'll look at him?
But how old was he?
I was 7,
And how old was your brother?
a year older.
No, the other brother was 10 years old.
Oh, 10 years older, the engineer, yeah.
17.
Yeah. But he'd already graduated from college, but he,
He's 17?
Yeah, he was the smart kid in the family. That was unfortunate because they didn't leave anything for me. But anyway, we brought the plans out, and my older brother opened them up and pulled them out, and he started to laugh. His laughter was caused because the plans were German and metric. My brother and I didn't know what metric was, for crying out loud. And of course, we didn't know anything about German, so my dad finally said, well, he said, take him down to the German Lutheran church in town and see if the pastor there will consider finding someone in his congregation that could do it. So we did. And sure enough, next Sunday he announced that he had these plans, and one of the engineers there was a German, and he took the plans home, and not only did he change the German to English, but he also changed the metric to English measure, so we came. Then in the next 2 years, we built the glider, complete 32-foot wingspan, and then we taught ourselves how to fly. Now I call it the world's first simulator. We'd set the glider with the guy in the cockpit on a log, headed into the wind. Then you could pitch, roll, yaw. And we did that until we thought we were good enough, and then we talked to my mom, and she came out and towed us. I was 12 years old, and made my first flight when I was 12. By the end of the day, we were climbing to 300 feet and making a 90-degree turn. But we needed a place to fly, you know. We knew of this airport that had gone belly up during the Depression, so fortunately the son of the man that owned the airport also was in my class in school. And so we went to him and said, we'd like to get that airport to fly off of. And he said, well, get the money together and we'll talk about it. But he said, your father has to sign the lease. So we scrounged and scrounged. We got $25 together. My dad went with us on a Saturday morning out to this fellow's house. Horatio Ford was his name. And of course he said, do you have money? We said, well, you know, we got $25. He said, well, that'll do it. Mr. Carson, would you sign the 5-year lease on that airport?
5 year?
For $25.
Wow.
There were some conditions. We
What
had to
year was
repair.
that?
Beg pardon?
What year?
Well, I was 12 years old, so that would have been 33.
Wow.
And some of the condition was we had to repair the hangar because the hangar roof leaked, and it was not it was a fairly big building, 80-foot entry span and 140 feet deep.
Wow, big.
And the kids had kind of ravaged it after the airport folded up in the Depression, so the holes kicked in the walls and stuff like that. So we said, oh, that's a good deal. We do that. And my older brother said, you know, they're tearing apart the shipyard down there on the waterfront. You ought to go down. They got a lot of corrugated iron down there. So we went down and asked who the foreman was, you know, and finally got the guy. And we said, how much is the galvanized roofing? He said, you got a truck? 12-year-old kid. So he said, yeah. He said, well, if you get a truck, I'll load the sucker, and you can have as much of it as you want. So we went to my dad and borrowed the mill truck. We go down there and they pick it up with a steam crane with a magnet on it. Kaboom! And then we drive 20 miles to the airport, and boy, it was tough unloading it a little bit at a time, you know. My younger brother said, hey, we've got to solve this problem, so we laid a couple of ropes across the stake bed, you know. We went down and got the next load, kabam, and there we got out and tied it to the hangar and drove out the load. We got 4 loads that day at the hangar.
How you got it on the roof? How did you get it on the roof?
Would be stuck.
Well, after you go one sheet at a time, it's not hard. We had, I got to tell you this, we had a thing called a World War I jumping balloon? You ever heard of that?
Yeah.
Well, this was a thing, a theory, they were going to use it to quietly travel at night across the trenches. And you would jump up in the air with this balloon, which presumably would have hydrogen in it.
Oh, boy.
And the wind would carry you across the German lines and you'd attack them from behind. Well, I don't know. There was an FA guy, his name was Bullock, that brought this jumping balloon out to our hangar. So when it wasn't suitable for flying, we'd inflate the balloon with cooking gas. And then we could go out, and the stunt was to jump high enough so the wind would carry you over the hangar and onto the other side. And we did that. That was our pastime when we were flying the gliders. But this fellow Bullock, after, you know, we were flying every Saturday and Sunday at this little airport, and the CAA then had Stinson, or Fairchild 24s. And on Saturday, we'd see this black and orange Fairchild come in and land. It was Mr. Bullock. And he'd watch us fly, and then later in the day, he'd take off and go back. Sunday, he'd come back and watch us fly. Well, after a couple of weeks of that, when my brother said to Mr. Bullock, he said, would you like to try flying the glider? He said, yeah, I would. And he'd seen us, we'd carry little bags with flour in them, you know. Part of our glide around the field, we'd bomb targets with that. The idea was you'd always spot land, so all we'd do is turn the glider 90 degrees, look at the tow line, and ready to go. Well, Bullock made several flights. He never came even close to spot landing. So at the end of the day, he says, why don't you two go over and take the written exam for private? Okay, what's that for us? And he said, well, I can waive the dual requirement. If you get the written passed, I'll give you a flight check, and if you pass, I'll give you a private license. Well, the interesting thing was, we didn't know anything about written exams, you know. We rode the trolley for 25 miles over to the airport and sit down, and we're taking exams, and they weren't as bad then as they are now, but we passed. I don't know what our grade was, but we passed. So in an appropriate time, Mr. Bullock says, you know, he says, you have to find a licensed airplane to take this flight check in. Because in those days, we had registered airplanes, which would be akin to the sport pilot maybe today. But these are airplanes that FAA didn't care a hoot about, or CAA. So anyway, we went out to Dewey Eldred's field, which was about 30 miles away. We negotiated with him to get an airplane to take our flight check in. And he said, okay, I got an Aranca C3 here, you can take the check. Only problem was we had to get it from his airport to our field. So we just got in and flew it up there. The FAA never asked us how we got it there. But, he gave us both flight checks, and then we ended up with private license.
Wow.
And I never had any dual. The only dual I had was when I got in the Air Force.
Yeah.
And when I got in the Army Air Corps, I said to myself, well, when they separate us, you know, they say, anybody with flying experience over here, no flying experience over here, so I'd go over there. I'd get some duals, see?
Yeah.
So I was getting my primary training out of Oxnard, California. And the owner of that particular school was also my instructor. And we'd go up and go through these routines, you know. And we were coming back, we were at Ventura, California, southbound along the coast, and I looked back there and here's this beautiful field, and I thought, man, what a place to take off with a sailplane, because you got ocean breeze on the ridge and you can soar back and forth. All of a sudden, power comes off, you say, force landing!
Oh.
So it's behind me, so I just grabbed the controls and made a quick turn, set up a base leg, went in 50 feet, you're supposed to give the engine back. He had it locked.
Oh.
So I had to go ahead and land. by the time we rolled out, and it was a wheat field, he's on the side, turned around the cockpit, banging his fuselage. How much flying time you got? So unfortunately, that was the end of my duel from then on. He'd demonstrate, but he'd never give me any training. So it was kind of hard, you know. I sure wasn't very excited about going into combat with no experience, but yeah, that was a great time. And then I soloed 3 hours and some minutes in the Stearman, and then went to basic and soloed in less than 4 hours, and then went to advanced twin engine and soloed in less than 4 hours. Never any duel. You know what you're doing, you go and fly. And then graduation out of twin engine, you know, you're either going to go P-38s or you're going to go bombers, or thought C-47s. But anyway, we got to graduation and we went through and they called off. These guys are going to B-17s, these to B-29s, 24s. 10 of us sitting there. No, the names weren't called. So finally we went up to the master of ceremony, the colonel, and said, "What's with us? You're going to instructor school." And we were supposedly the top 10%. I think they arbitrarily went through and just picked names. But anyway, they sent us off to instructor school. And we got 25 hours in instructor school. And now we were instructors. And we were instructing in twin engine. We only had 40 hours in twin engine before we went to instructor school. And, you know, that's pretty minimal. And we were a bunch of kids, you know, and out there training people.
Which twin was it?
Well, we had AT-9s, which is Curtis Wright, and it was called the Flying Prostitute. And because it had no visible means of support. Two 300 horsepower Lycomies, and the wings stuck out about 8 feet beyond the engines. And the other thing they said about that airplane is it does everything at 150 miles an hour. Takes off, climbs, cruises, stalls, and lands at 150. The other airplanes we had were Cessnas, UC-78s. Very nice airplane.
Bamboo bomber?
Oh,
Yeah, yeah.
Can I
A
ask
lot
you-
of it. Yes?
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. I just am curious. You have a long and illustrious history in aviation, and I'm wondering, can you tell us, or maybe you already have, your most memorable and rewarding aviation experience?
Well, you know, that Beechcraft program for 2,000 hours was a pretty darn good one.
Yeah.
A lot of other things, you know, we did over the time. I had the Stinson Reliant. How many know what a Reliant is? And at one point I got, this is when I was with Lamson Aircraft, found out that Boeing needed little parts ferried around for the dew line, or the missile line. I forgot what they called it, all around the U.S. And so they'd call up, and I'd fly in from Yakima and pick up the cargo, which is usually a box about that big square, weighed 3 or 4 pounds. And this one time when they said, "Boy, this is really important. We got to get this to Rapid City." So I looked, and well, you know, 120 miles an hour, Rapid City, and you know, it's taking a little while. But that airplane had 9 hours of fuel on board. You could fill the tanks. And so I took off and I flew nonstop to Rapid City. Got in there and I'm, as you might guess, pretty well pooped. A lot of hours, and you know, not only was it the flight from Seattle to Rapid City, but Yakima to Seattle, and then sit around while they got the cargo, and you had to sign more paper than what the cargo looked like. And so I'm not on the ground at Rapid City more than just a few minutes, and this guy comes running down with a little box. He says, "We got to get this to Albuquerque." I said, "Well, I'll rest and then I'll take it down there." "No, it's got to go right now."
Of course.
So I thought, well, okay. So I flew it down there and get there, and they come out with another box. This has to go back to Seattle right away. So I flew some 30 hours without a rest. So I'm coming back, you know where Mullen Pass is?
Oh, yeah.
In those days, Mullen Radio was right up in the pass, and I'm half asleep, and I forgot to call in and make my position report. And, that airplane had a 150-foot trailing wire. You could talk to anybody in the United States. But all of a sudden, I hear this voice, "Kit Carson, is that you? Kit Carson, is that you?" And I come and said, "Oh, yeah, I forgot to call you." She said, "Are you asleep?" And really, that Stinson was so darn good. Once you got it trimmed out, you could probably sleep. But anyway, then she said, "You want me to call your wife and tell her you're being Mullen Pass to Seattle?" Try that today. They will not make a call for you today. But I said, "Yeah, do that." And she called and told Virginia when I'd be in, and she came pick me up at the airport. But, how many knows what the light line was called, that the airmail pilots used?
Oh, yeah, the barrels of fire.
Rotating beacon lights every 20 miles. When I came to Seattle in 1940, the light line was still operating across the pass.
Wow.
Each beacon light had a rotating white light and then a flashing red light or green light, depending on whether it's at the airport or not. And the beacon lights were all coded for the run, like the one that went right by our home was Cleveland to Buffalo, New York. So you start out of Cleveland, 20 miles, the light was right on next to my dad's place. And that was beacon number 1. And that was number 2, number 3, so you could tell where you were just by the beacon lights. Of course, if you missed a beacon light, you might get a little confused. But that was what the mail pilots used. And one Christmas Eve, my older brother, he was the engineer, he was at home probably, I don't know why, but anyway, he was at home, and this mail plane would come and circle the number 1 beacon light, and then he'd head out for Cleveland Airport. In a few minutes, he'd be back and circle. My brother calls up all the neighboring farms, and he said, "Get your cars and go up by the beacon." So they all went up by the beacon, and everybody had their lights on. And when the airplane circled, we'd flash our lights. And pretty soon he flashed his lights. And then we all took off for the airport, which was 7 or 8 miles away. And he followed the crowd, and it was snowing like, get out. And we all lined up along the runway at the airport, which it was a grass field. There wasn't really any runway, but we lined up, so you have lights. And he came in and landed. And my brother walks up and says, "You can come and stay at our house." He said, "No, that's the mail plane. I can't leave the mail." And he got his sleeping bag out and rolled it out under the airplane in the snow and slept there all night.
Oh, boy.
Wow.
And then the next morning, he cranked up the engine. Liberty engine, Douglas mail plane.
What year was that?
Beg pardon?
What year do you think that was?
34, maybe 35. It was the year before the Army Air Corps tried to fly the mail. And try was
That was
a
about
good
it.
determination of it.
The reason he was coming back to the beacon was probably because he couldn't get to the airport.
Yeah, he couldn't find the airport. And
So you guys saved him.
oh yeah. That same pilot, many years later, was flying a Malanka float plane out of Cleveland to the gold fields up in Ontario. And fortunately, my brother and I were well known in the aviation community, and he would call up and say, "I have to have cargo loaded, can you come down and do it?" And we'd get on the interurban and go down there and load the cargo and get paid 25 cents an hour or whatever the heck it was. And this one day he called up and he said, "I've got a big load here," and get as many kids together as you can to see if we can get this in the airplane. Got down there, it was a big diesel engine.
Oh, gosh.
All cast iron, right? And we winched that thing, or I think we used rope lifts. Got it up in the airplane. It's about this far behind the pilot's seat. And Hank gets in the thing, cranks up the engine, takes off. 2 days later, we get a call, and it's from the CAA, and they say, you know when Mr. Morgan took off from Cleveland? I said, yeah, he took off such and such a time on Sunday. Well, he never made it to the gold mine. 3 days later, he got there. And what happened is, see, the magnet in the compass thought that big diesel engine was great. So he was heading out of Cleveland, was due north. Unfortunately, that's where the compass set, but it didn't change. And when he ran out of fuel, in those days, around all the lakes up there in Ontario, and probably Alaska too, they would set barrels out on the shore. So if anybody got short of fuel, they would land, and the barrels had a sign on lake, something or other, whatever it was. And he found this lake, and he landed up there and taxied up the shore, and this lake.
Frozen lake.
Yeah, no, water. He was a float plane.
Oh, float plane, okay.
And he gets his maps out, looked, and he says, gee, I'm 100 miles west of where I'm supposed to be. That's when he discovered, he went and looked at the compass, it still hadn't due north. But
All that metal in the back.
anyway, 3 days later, he found his way to the gold mine and unloaded that diesel engine. He jokingly said, I don't think I'll haul any big cast iron things anymore.
Well, thank you. No, I'm sorry. No, we're like 15 minutes over. So we'll have to have Kit come back another time and fill us in on the rest of his story.
Where'd the pictures end up? Did you get them, John?
Yeah.
Over here.